Last session of the day, the witching hour, you're still here. I hope I add value for this next 45, 50 minutes or so and share a perspective on this interesting concept of stress. If you've just been in Glenda's session, then this will tie in nicely. Because this world of stress is relevant to everyone, but it's a huge potential opportunity to the fitness sector, as I would see it. But before we enter anything, we need to understand it. And I want to do a bit of an A to Z on a perspective on stress, a perspective on whether you can measure stress, where stress meets recovery, and how might this all interspace with a commercial gym environment. And that's the weave I'm going to try and bring in over the next session. I love being heckled. I get it a lot at home and in life. So if I say something that jars, shout me down. Otherwise, it may be a monologue for 45, 50 minutes. I sensed Glenda might chip in. My background is quite important because I'm not the sum of a qualification stood on this stage. I'm the sum of 25 years of clinical practice. So I'm not going to download the World Health Organization guidelines on stress and just repeat those to you. I'm not going to tell you what the statistics say. I'm going to say, what have I learned in my clinical practice? So a bit of a journey in my clinical practice is relevant to how I came to understand that I, as an exercise scientist, could have an integral role in helping people manage stress. Whereas previously I would have thought, that's not in my scope of practice, certainly not in my remit. My broad, again, career is, I suppose, interestingly, I started the Nuffield Health Physiology department in 2005, where we finally took exercise scientists and put them in a clinical setting. And it wasn't that difficult, because we took someone who understood movement prescription, and we added exercise prescription and sleep and recovery prescription, and we made ourselves a clinician. And I believe that opportunity is something that hasn't been grasped fully by the broader sector. Nuffield commercialized it pretty well. Any Nuffield in tonight? Nuffield hate me. They don't hate me. We left on good terms. But Nuffield did an interesting thing in terms of it rebuilt a brand around well-being, but it needed a well-being professional at the heart of it. And the physiology team was the heart of that rebranding. What's potentially more relevant today, I then spent 12 years on London's Harley Street delivering a £15,000 annual medical, which means I'm going straight to hell the minute I die, because that's morally questionable, but it was clinically interesting. So imagine I had 15 grand to try and work out a very simple question with all of you, which is, are you well? That was the question I had to work out. And how are we defining well? And that became really interesting. But I didn't start at a 15 grand assessment. I started with a very basic assessment that's going to lead me to talk to these topics today. I'm going to go into it in a sec. But I want to cover these 5 key areas, and I'll whistle through them, but really want to talk about health, well-being, fitness. What is the difference between those words? What are we? What could we be? We've talked about stress from a mindset point of view, but we've known since the 1930s stressed people got physically ill. So how does that work? How does that interplay with poor sleep? One of Glenda's top 4 tips, we've got to build sleep. If I fix your sleep, I fix you tomorrow. If I fix your fitness, I maybe fix you in 3 months' time. So sleep is a huge low-hanging fruit. We'll talk about that. Where could that tie into fitness 2.0 and opportunities? Nice and vague. This is sort of my favorite graph. It's a bit like a version of what Glenda had up. It's the illness-wellness continuum rebranded. This was built by Dr. John Travis in the 1970s to try and explain good health, performance, neutral. Right? And when I first started in health screening, I had imposter syndrome, which is pretty logical. I was an exercise scientist, graduated with sports science, in a 3-hour medical with a nurse and a doctor. And I was the person at the end who would run a stress electrocardiogram and give an exercise program. And I was like, oh my God, I'm around these really established clinicians. And I was in that 3-hour medical, and at the end of it, the doctor would pass the person into my office and they'd say, Ollie, Mr. Jones is really well. He's passed all the tests. Just give him some exercise to do. I'd be like, that's great. Now, Mr. Jones would go, Ollie, it's great the doctor said I'm well, but can't get to sleep for 2 hours, and I wake up pretty much every night. It's great the doctor said I'm well, but I'm knackered mid-afternoon, fall asleep, in fact. So I need coffees and Red Bulls. It's great the doctor said I'm well, but I haven't wanted to have sex with my wife or my girlfriend for the last 3 months. It's great the doctor says I'm well, but I get certain spots and acne when I eat certain foods. And I fart loads when I eat asparagus. Again, for legal reasons, Mr. Jones is not one person. It's an amalgam of lots of different people. But what was interesting is they'd been through a pretty intense Harley Street-esque medical that hadn't taken a moment to ask them what bothered them. It had said, you're not having a heart attack today, Mr. Jones, so your cardiovascular system is fine. You're not actively representing a cancer that's probably the size of a tennis ball, maybe a basketball, so you don't have cancer. So you must be well. And it plays into that idea of what are we defining as well? Is it the absence of ill? And the World Health Organization would define good health as a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, right? That's pretty intense. A complete state of physical, mental, social well-being. Has anyone been to the doctor this year? A GP, NHS GP, yeah? Roughly how long do you know the appointment was? 5 minutes, 7 minutes? It wasn't NHS. You might have got 15 minutes if you went private. Lucky. If you go NHS, maybe 6 minutes, 7 minutes. Do you know what's great about the NHS? You're only allowed one health problem per consultation. So if you go in with a sore left toe and a sore right toe, you've got to pick your favorite toe. Yeah. And I'll take away the problem you came with, not the reason the problem's there. It's an interesting challenge. That's not a doctor's fault. That's an operational limitation of a scalable system. So we have a really interesting challenge that we have a medical system that is highly reactive. Now, that's not a slur on the NHS. It's not a slur on any healthcare system. In fact, we have in the UK arguably the greatest healthcare system in the world. But it's not its job to make you healthy. And it's not the job, culturally or technically, to stop you becoming unwell. It's their job to catch you becoming unwell. And when I started health screening, the remit of my health screening was interesting. If I look at this parameter here, it's like we base the idea of the neutral point is the British definition of being well, which is if you ask someone if they're well, they go, well, I'm not bad. You know, how are you? I'm okay. Nothing fell off this morning. Right? That's not quite flourishing. That's not optimal well-being. So my job was theoretically to find people getting ill before signs, symptoms, dysfunction with some kind of clever test. Spoiler alert, there's no test clever enough to find it. And in many cases, we were telling people they didn't have diseases that we couldn't be sure they didn't with tests that wouldn't find it. And we're giving them a false sense of reassurance. We're telling people, you don't have any problem with cardiovascular disease. And then they die in the car park of a heart attack. That happened 2 or 3 times. Interesting, screening's really difficult. But what became interesting to me is we had lots of data on dysfunctional people. How do we find dysfunctional? But we didn't have any data on the people who were non-dysfunctional, but certainly weren't highly functional. So what were the common themes coming into that office? I'm super stressed. Well, who's the most stressed person in this room? Don't put your hand up. Is that quantifiable? Who's the closest to burnout? Physical conditions. Don't point at your colleagues either. That's bad practice. Yeah, stress isn't some amorphous principle. Stress turns physiological. So there must be markers that we can quantify who's failing under their stress load, who's flourishing under their stress load. So I became interested in heart rate variability as a mechanism to create a better dialogue over who's closer to burnout and who's not. Who eats the best diet in this room? Do we judge that on the Tanita scales, body composition? Or is there more to diet than calories? What about nourishment? Who's the most nourished? Who's got the greatest abundance of nutrients in the cells of their body? That's why we eat, surely. We don't take any data on that. So we brought in antioxidant measurements of the skin to try and engage in diversity of fruit and vegetable intake. Who's most likely to get injured doing one of Glenda's squats? It's me. What's my biomechanical pattern that predisposes me to injury? Do we just guess? Again, we took markers, objective markers of movement quality. And in that process, we brought in data objectively about subjective topics. And that became really interesting. And that was a pivot on which Nuffield relaunched itself, that we would then measure not ill people, but normal people, Gen Pop, and engage them in activities that would improve their stress, their nutrition, and their musculoskeletal robustness. I raise that because what we often think is subjective has now moved on a little bit. And subjective is critical. How I feel is critical. But there's a data layer above and beyond that in the 21st century. And that data layer is evolving faster than the skills of the practitioners to interpret it and democratize it. And because data is moving faster than practitioner levels, data's cut the practitioner out of it. And I want to talk about that today. If you're wearing a device, my brother-in-law, who is a data nerd, turned up the other day with his watch, and he was like, oh, it's measuring my SpO2, my oxygen saturation. It's measuring my blood pressure. It's measuring my heart rate variability, my sleep cycles. It's measuring my VO2 max. It's measuring my body battery. It wasn't measuring how much of a bragger he was at this point. Measured all these things. He's like, what's it all mean, Ollie? I was like, well, they've got a version of what it means, but there's no context to it. There's no professional who interprets the data being aggregated by the latest Garmin, the latest X other. And if we don't want to be that person, again, that's fine, but let's make that an informed choice, not an uninformed choice. So my job, again, was then later in life to run a £15,000 health assessment, which no diagnostics off the table, no consultants off the table. If there's a substance that comes out of a human, I have seen it, I have tested it, and some of that is pretty grotesque. But, again, the more data we have, the better we can make decisions. And when we started doing these advanced health assessments, we thought we'd find disease more easily, more pressingly. We still didn't. Still, the best sign of disease is when an individual notices, I used to work this way, now I work differently. My breast used to be soft, now it's firm. I used to pee 6 times a day, now I pee 20 times a day. I used to not be tired at 4 o'clock, now I'm exhausted. That's more sensitive than your best top-end screening, just as an FYI. What we did start to find is that what we were looking at with health was really the wrong thing. We were looking at, and again, if you were in Glenda's session, we talk about roots and leaves. And how many of the physical problems people were presenting were the symptoms of something else. And that something else being dysfunctional lifestyle. So when I got into lifestyle, really, I thought lifestyle was Instagram cartwheels with the kids. Lifestyle was, what I put out there. And we really started to see that people's health, well-being, and performance were all affected really by one thing, which is how well my underlying physiology works. Right? If I take this spectrum and think health isn't binary, it's linear, and you work between dysfunctional and optimized, what runs along the base of that is your physiology. If I take cardiovascular fitness, an interesting parameter, if your cardiovascular fitness is so low, you can't deliver oxygen to your tissue, you die. If your cardiovascular fitness is extremely high, you might be able to win the Tour de France. It's a linear biological system that when it gets too low, gets classified as disease. It's quite an interesting one. And in fact, VO2 max, the marker of cardiovascular fitness, is the single best predictor of how long you'll live and how well you will be to the end of your days. And it sits within your capability. Spoiler alert, the second best marker of how long you'll live is how much muscle tissue you can retain after 35. So why gyms aren't at the front of the longevity and health question is a really challenging point. What became interesting to us is when you measure everything to do with health and well-being over years, so you take the same person again and again, you get to see what works and what doesn't. And what we're basically seeing is most people in their presentation were the sum of their lifestyle, but lifestyle is much more than movement. Movement is one facet of an interface with my physiology. So is my nourishment, right? I am the function of the foods I ate or chose not to eat today. But I'm also the function of my biological ability to restore energy. You're all a big battery, expending. When do you recoup? Sleep is the biggest opportunity, but not the only. But you're also a function of your environment. If I stick you within 100 meters of a main road, you're more likely to have a heart attack. If I stick that main road under a flight path, you're more likely to die early. If I stick that in a radioactive plant, it all becomes catastrophic. We're a function of our environment from an air pollution, noise pollution. We're a function of light and dark. We're a function of the place we find ourselves, and beyond that, the culture we find ourselves in. So environment affects my physiology and the way I think. Again, if I think something good is going to happen or something bad is going to happen, I'm probably right. Okay, so from a mindset point of view, if I predict endless catastrophic events, my physiology will prepare for them. If I predict endless fantastic events, my physiology will prepare for them. The way I think, which is of course affected by the way my life has been before, will affect me. So we've got to start redefining what is well-being, because well-being is so fluffy and so light, and lifestyle is so fluffy and so light. So let's put a framework that we can work against. You are the sum of the positive inflections on your physiology versus the negative inflections, plus minus your genetic material. And that broadly would describe most of the health, performance, and functional conditions I've seen over the last 25 years. We used to think our health was in our genes, and when they decoded DNA in the 90s, I think it was Bill Clinton was like, we've today uncovered the language in which God created life. And we're like, well, we'll find the cancer gene, and we'll find the heart disease gene, we'll find the Alzheimer's gene. No such thing. And in fact, the contribution of our genetic material to your health outcomes, as in can you blame your mum and dad if it all goes tits up, went from being 60, 70% now down to maybe 5% and falling. Your genes do not determine your health outcome. That's different to genetic disease, which you're born with, but your predisposition. And a good example of genetic disease versus genomics would be, have I got an increased risk of skin cancer because of my genes? It's an interesting challenge. I'm always so popular on holiday because the sun lounger next to me, you're going to look so tanned, so good, so bronzed, because there's an albino, alabaster character laid out splayed next to you. In the holiday photo, you're going to look so bronzed. So have I got increased risk of skin cancer? Actually, me having lighter skin is a physiological adaptation to less sunlight, so I make more vitamin D. Right? So it's a physiological benefit that when I offset that into the wrong environment, too much UVA, UVB has an increased predisposition to cancer. So I have a genetic strength and a weakness in something as visible as the tone of my skin. So the question then is, do I sunbathe? Do I use SPF 30? My lifestyle will determine whether that gene becomes a problem. Does that make sense? You're not the function of your genes, you're the function of your genes plus your environment plus your lifestyle. But your lifestyle is weighing up, and if you don't feel the way you want to feel, then we have to look at which activities are negatively inflecting your physiology and which ones are positively inflecting, and can we take one off the negative and add one to the positive. But if you think you can do that through movement alone, you haven't understood how physiology works, because movement is one of 5 areas that affects your physiology. So you can't solve human health and well-being through activity. You have to be able to influence all the factors that influence human physiology. And at the moment, if we're only controlling one and controlling it on an average basis, we're missing out on the well-being opportunity. This clinical case study is interesting because we had a lady come to us who couldn't lose weight, had fatigue. So that's a pretty common trademark entry point for a gym or for an advanced health assessment. And she had seen 5 great Harley Street consultants, cardiologist, get rid of my blood pressure. She'd seen an endocrinologist who'd noticed her sugar was too high, medicated her for pre-diabetes. She'd seen a gastroenterologist who noticed her stomach acidity was too high. I put her on a proton pump inhibitor. She had seen a psychiatrist because her mood stability was low, put her on an antidepressant. And she had seen a sports physician because her knee kept getting inflamed. He put her on an anti-inflammatory, right? Not uncommon. We all know someone who's on 5, 6 medications. Now, what's interesting about this lady is she personal trained 5 times a week. High intensity. She was beasting. Just, again, she was perimenopausal, early 50s. She was on food delivery from a very established food delivery firm, so she's doing calorie restriction. So she's moving, she's nourishing, but she's stubborn. And it's only if we extend our scope of practice beyond fitness and nourishment that we saw she wasn't sleeping. She was physiologically hypervigilant. I'll define that in a minute. And the cause of that was a dysfunctional relationship. Let's imagine a husband of some description. Tricky husband, physiological stress, poor sleep. When we look at the physiology of sleep, it's very clear high blood pressure is a symptom of that. Too much stomach acidity is a symptom of that. High glucose is a symptom of that. Low sleep quality is a symptom of that. Her ability to turn off inflammation is a symptom of that. She went to see 5 doctors who each took away a symptom of a broader problem, which was inadequate recovery. And that is terrifying. She could have kept going because they'll keep popping up and they'll keep emerging. So with this person, our intervention was to stop personal training and stop calorie restriction. We taught her to meditate and we took her for a lunchtime walk. And in a year, she's off all 5 medications. Because the medications are symptoms of dysfunctional physiology. There's another symptom we keep tapering with, which is always interesting to me. Again, I came through King's Cross relatively late yesterday, and I saw, I'm going to say 70% of people with a coffee cup. If you don't receive pain signals, you die young, because pain is a feedback loop, right? If you don't have pain and you put a little stone in your shoe, it buries itself in, gets infected, you get sepsis and you die. Because pain is a feedback loop. There's a stone in my shoe, I can feel it with the pain. What's fatigue? Fatigue's a feedback loop. And, I wouldn't say to someone who's in pain all the time, continue to take ibuprofen for life. Kill that signal. I'd say, where's the pain coming from? Fatigue, we've done the complete opposite. Because we can blast it through with caffeine, a genius drug, we've got, again, a real interesting crisis. And what was happening here is fatigue was the main symptom that showed there was inadequate physiological recovery, and she was finding every way means possible to override it. So we have to listen to our body. And this, again, showed us very clearly that restoring energy lies at the heart of a well-being strategy. So I love the boom of recovery. I love it. Everyone's going, recovery is the future of fitness. It's like, well, just define recovery for me quickly. Well, recovery is putting hyper-ice trousers on me, hyper-ice therabody. Is product interesting? And what's the logic of percussion? What's the logic of compression? No, recovery, sorry, I misunderstood you. It's an ice bath. It's an ice bath on Instagram. That's recovery. No, misunderstood, sorry. No, it's a sauna. A sauna is recovery. Sorry, what's your definition of recovery? Because I'm finding that interesting. Are you talking about quelling localized inflammation to allow me to train again tomorrow? Is that Andy Murray's version of recovery? Yeah. I love it when Wimbledon's on. Everyone gets an ice bath. It's like, I've got to be ready tomorrow, man, because I'm playing another 5-setter. Misuse of interventions is as dangerous as not use, interestingly. So recovery, is it about reducing localized inflammation? Yeah, maybe. What's the biggest opportunity for recovery? Well, if I frame recovery, it's biological processes that restore energy and manage excessive inflammation. And that puts me into the bracket, the biggest source of recovery would be sleep. I do it for a third of my life. I don't do it for no reason. The second biggest area will be management of stress. I'm going to talk about that now. And the third area will be managing unwarranted inflammation. And if someone hasn't got the energy that they would expect, then I go to energetic restoring processes first, because that's logical. And when I talk about those people, the Mr. Jones who came in for the health assessment, no one's that interested in preventing cardiovascular disease. If they were, gyms would be full. No one's that interested in preventing cancer until they've had it. People are interested in how they feel now. And the only problem that I can solve for a collective audience is energy, because no one doesn't want more. If it's 8, you want a 10. If it's 4, you want a 6. And I've worked with chronic fatigue in various different forms, and they just want to be able to get out of bed. But the process is the same. More energy is the outcome of choice. So today I want to talk a little bit about how stress negatively affects available energy. And that energy would express into my physical energy. I'm knackered, I want a coffee. That will express negatively into my cognitive energy. I can't strategically think. I get stuck. I keep losing my car keys. It would express into my emotional energy. Oh my God, I can't call my auntie. She absolutely murders me on the phone for half an hour, so I'll delay it. And it will play into my spiritual energy, which is the chance to go and seek purposefulness. But let's stay on the physical, because it's a nice, safe territory. Again, how do I stop people needing a coffee when they wake up? So stress is an interesting topic. Glenda put up a great version of this, and I love the idea. When I speak to organizations about stress, they bring me in because I go, stress is positive. And they're like, that's all we wanted to hear. Go home now. Just wanted to make sure everyone understood. Stress is positive. It's really positive. And as, again, Glenda's talking about, again, boredom being as damaging as hyperstress. Couldn't agree more. The drone zone, disastrous. I've looked after, again, lots of high net worth individuals who have no purpose in their life. They have no role, responsibility, and they're as dysfunctional as they come. And I know what you're thinking. Give me that money and I'll show them some fun. Again, it's difficult. Oh, my graph's gone off. I'm going to keep playing it. So the pressure performance curve, you probably did this in sports psychology if you did it, but it works on the idea, I don't know if anyone's running the slides can pause it, it's going to knock itself off, that stress is positive. In fact, a world without pressure is a world without performance. Usain Bolt won't break a world record in his back garden. It's probably big enough. He'll break it in Olympic Games. Right? Partly periodization, partly the world is watching. And what's interesting about pressure is people fear it, and of course we need it. We need it for optimum performance. What's interesting about pressure as well, people get nervous when it's too much. But you know you only grow when you do what you cannot do. So we're not aiming for eustress on this graph, the point where my resources match my pressures. We're aiming for pockets of hyperstress. Like, I want progressive overload of my muscles. I grow by being given something I can't quite do. I grow by facing a challenge I can't quite face. When the whole logic of imposter syndrome is that's people going out doing something that's a little bit too big for them, and then they find I am able to do it, and they build that self-efficacy, that belief. So we do not want to shy away from stress. We want to walk straight into it. But what's interesting is if those pressures are too great for our coping mechanisms, for too long, we get physically ill. Hans Selye, again, a relatively non-rat-friendly scientist from the 1930s, he stressed rats, and he was like, he didn't stress them physically, he sort of tortured them with cheese, then took it away, cheese, took it away, the bastard. Yeah, and he noticed that those poor cheeseless rats developed stomach ulcers, yet nothing was touching their stomach. He noticed their thyroid gland, which produced a hormone that kept their metabolism, their calorie burning, it wasted away. He noticed their adrenal gland, which sits on top of their kidneys, got massive. And he was like, all right, I was just taking away the cheese. But stress became physiological. Right? He stressed them psychologically and they physically deteriorated. And that's when stress became interesting to me as a physiologist, because we're always told stress is a psychologist's domain or a therapist's domain. Very much not so. Because if stress is left untoward, there are physiological signs of it. So what would I measure if I was trying to say, who is the most stressed person in this room? I'd want your story first and foremost. What's your story? What's your energy? What's your emotional capacity? The story is still more interesting than the physiology, but the physiology will enable you to challenge or consolidate the story. So if I saw someone who was regularly overwhelmed by the volume of pressures they face, then their body starts to deteriorate. Why? So a couple of things happen. They'll start to produce excessive cortisol. They don't do it straight away. It's a late stage warning signal. That's a salivary cortisol release pattern up in the top right-hand corner, where I want cortisol to be pumped out like an absolute rock star at 4 o'clock in the morning, but I want it down low as I go to bed. Otherwise, I'll be tired but wired. So it's a really interesting hormone that works with our circadian rhythm. I'll come back to that in a bit. I could measure your electroencephalography and look at the brain waves going on and say that your brain is not nice and calm. It's scanning for the next danger. Again, you've used the word hypervigilance, Glenda, and I agree with that. We used to run quantitative electroencephalography, and we found people who were highly stressed were looking for the next stress. Yeah? If you were attacked walking down the street as a child, you'll walk down the street waiting for an attack. It's a hypervigilance. It's why childhood trauma predisposes people to a heightened stress response. They've learned to look for the next one, right? The more stresses I look for, the more I will see. You watch people who've got a fear of flying on a plane, and that plane makes a 2-degree change of direction. They're up there. What's happening? Can someone contact the pilot? Planes just moved 2 degrees, pal. Yeah. But they're hypervigilant. They see everything and they create more stress response as a result. So I've got the story, I've got cortisol, I've got, again, the neurology of stress in the fact that a nice concentrated brain would show different brainwave patterns to a brain that's looking for impending danger and to setting me up for it. And then I've got this brilliant tool that I talked about already called heart rate variability, which I put up here because heart rate variability is already probably on the devices you're wearing, and it's certainly out there as a consumer opportunity. And do we understand how it ties into the stress picture? So heart rate variability is an interesting science. So let's dive into that a little bit. When someone goes to me, I'm measuring my heart rate variability, I go, that's great. So you must be a mathematical scientist because it's a mathematical result. I say, what you're measuring with heart rate variability is the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. If I measure someone's cholesterol, I don't tell them that I'm doing this through photometry. I don't tell them about the method of collection. I tell them about the cholesterol result. If you're measuring heart rate variability, you're trying to get a window into the soul of the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. And quick biology lesson, you're all being run by your autonomic nervous system now, right? Not your central nervous system. You're not the decision to move my legs and do whatever I want to do. You're all calibrating your heart rate now. You're all calibrating your blood pressure now. Up and down. You're calibrating your internal temperature now. You're choosing how much sugar should be in your bloodstream and not. You're making hundreds of intelligent decisions a second based on what? Based on what you think is about to happen next. Right? If I convince Rob to walk in here with a tray of hot cookies, then your physiology will go, I smell that cookie. That'll be lovely. Or a beer. I smell that beer, and I'm going to move a little bit of blood into my stomach. I'm going to slow my heart rate down. I'm going to prepare for digestive processes. And you might even salivate if I draw the picture in eyes. If, as a sort of prank, Rob released a live bear into the audience, your eyes would identify it, You would prepare physiologically, in a simplified phrase, to fight the bear. I'm sure some of you would fight. I'd back a few of you. Some of you I wouldn't back. Or to run away from the bear. So you'd have a very clear physiological response. Your blood would clot more quickly. Your pupils would dilate. You would remove digestive processes. You would enable more glucose to your muscles. You become a combustible machine. Right? And in simple terms, the reason you're told not to eat and swim is because you're asking your biology to do two things at the same time. I can't be ready to digest and restore energy as much as I'm ready to expend and flee. So you've got basically an accelerant of your biology and you've got a brake pedal. And you're all adjusting between those two states all through the day, depending on whether you think cookies are coming or a bear's coming. And on a simple basis, we could quantify that because with heart rate variability, we have a tool that enables me to determine which physiological system is in predominance. Because of the way the parasympathetic, this nervous system brake, interfaces directly with the heart, and because of the way the sympathetic accelerator chemically communicates with the heart. So we have a very simple basis. When I see low heart rate variability, I see more activity of the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system. If I see more heart rate variability, which sounds odd because we're told arrhythmia and heart rhythm is crucial, but if I see lots of variability of the heartbeat, then I'll see more of the parasympathetic. And if I frame that even more simply, when you are in sympathetic drive, your body is expending energy. When you're in parasympathetic, you're recouping energy. And the question then as a human battery is, are you getting the balance right between time spent expending, time spent recouping? And if you need 3 coffees before you wake up in the morning, you've probably answered that question for yourselves. So we can intelligently start to look at this parameter of heart rate variability and say, well, when I first started measuring it, I had to measure it for the 3 minutes that you were lying on my bed, not my bed, the bed in the clinic, not a weirdo. And I had a window to say, in this moment of time, how stressed does your physiology look? And if the environment was calm and your physiology was not, then I could make an assumption. Then we found the ability to measure these things ambulatory. So I'm putting up here some images from First Beat. First Beat are here today. I don't work for First Beat, but I've used First Beat for 13 years to quantify the autonomic nervous system activity of people I'm trying to help. They will love me for saying this, or maybe I'm on camera, God. But to me, the single most useful physiological parameter in the most advanced health assessment at that time in the world. Why? Because it's absolutely integral to all biological systems, right? So this is a normal heart rate variability pattern of someone who probably doesn't exist in the real world anymore, where we see green represents where the parasympathetic nervous system is in prevalence, red represents where the sympathetic or the stress system is in prevalence, and we have someone ebbing and flowing between those two biological systems, and particularly when they go to sleep, as indicated by the purple line, loads of parasympathetic tone, which would correlate with, doesn't necessarily mean good sleep cycles. Does that make sense? And we look for a ratio, again, the science is specific to providers, maybe 30% of my day spent in recovery, maybe 50, 60% spent in stress, and maybe the rest spent transitioning between the two. Now, this is what a normal person looks like. And I say normal in terms of population normal. I always love when people say, what's normal result? It's like, do you mean average or do you mean ideal? Do you want me to compare you to your peers who are also struggling, or what you could be if you'd made some changes? So this pattern is very consistent of where we found ourselves measuring stress over years, where we saw 0 to no physiological recovery in waking hours and suppressed physiological recovery into sleep. And what I've got now is the ability to start coaching someone meaningfully, quantitatively. I can start to determine the efficacy of things I'm going to recommend. Yesterday I was doing a talk on mindfulness meditation. Why? Because I've measured people pre and post and proven it effective. And what became interesting to me is, what are the things that move the dial on putting more green on the graph? Because green on the graph is energy in. And if I can bring more energy in, you name me the physiological benefit, and I'll tell you move towards it. If that person's sympathetic nervous system is dominant all day long, can we expect higher or lower heart rate? Let's play a game. Higher. Higher or lower blood pressure? Higher. Higher or lower blood glucose? Higher. Better or worse digestive system? Worse. Again, lethargy or abundance of energy? Lethargy. What was interesting about this result, this is not far off the result of the lady we measured, where she'd been given 5 medications for inadequate parasympathetic tone. And again, I like the idea, name me a condition that won't be improved with more available energy. Why do people with underlying health conditions die from COVID? It's the fact that there's not enough available energy to deal with the virus and the thing they had. At this point, I normally talk about herpes, but I don't know if I've got the time. Does everyone want a little chat about herpes? Hands up if you've got, no, don't. Well, if you have got herpes, it's quite an interesting disease. Herpes simplex, which is the old cold sore. Yeah, if you got a cold sore, you get herpes simplex and you have it for life. And you probably got it because you were lucky enough to snog someone at school or in the playground. So it's a bit of a badge of honor at school. It's like a cold sore in the club. And you can always trace it back to patient 0. Right? When do you get a cold sore? When you're run down. That's such a common phrase. What does run down mean? Stressed out. So I'm stressed out. So when I'm super busy or I drink too much booze, and we'll talk about booze and sleep, suddenly a virus I've always got pops up, right? You could save yourself the Whoop subscription and go and get yourself herpes. It's doing the exact same thing. You've had inadequate physiological recovery and you're getting a symptom. Yeah? And what do? Zovirex. Cover it up. It's talking to me, that thing. I'm going to bury it. And the next symptom, an ulcer, I'll bury it. They are biological signs that something you could control normally is now uncontrollable. Don't get herpes. I'm going to get sued. Get first being. Right? So here we have an interesting challenge that people are wandering around, and I'm going to draw this back to the point, the wellbeing industry is feasting on these people. It's feasting on false solutions to a problem it hasn't even identified. And I want to come back to that later. But does that make sense in principle? I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, the herpes bit's gone too far. What's interesting about that graph, if we go back and I'll see it, you can see that we don't go into qualities. The person fell asleep at just before midnight. We don't see any meaningful physiological recovery till the early hours, 3 o'clock, etc. That's a big problem because sleep is a big problem. And is stress's biggest mediator of dysfunction through compromising sleep? It's certainly one of, if not the. We have a sleep problem in this country. 60% of people cite a significant problem with their sleep. 30% of the absolute population, not 30% of the 60, have a chronic condition, be that sleep apnea, insomnia, something else, right? And I do want to talk to fitness professionals. You change someone's sleep, you will ignite their life. You get them fitter over 3 months, they'll be a bit meh, did it, might do. This is immediate returns because a couple of nights sleep, awful. I can go a long time without exercising. I can go a long time without eating nourishing food. I can go days without quality sleep. Days. 4 days, 5 days without sleep, and I'm dead. It's a hugely important process. Again, we spend a third of our lives doing, what are we doing with it? Sleep is a game of depth. And in many cases, the quantification of sleep is counterintuitive. People who don't sleep well, measuring it will cause a problem. People who do sleep well, measuring it will just turn them into a dinner party bore. Have you seen my deep sleep last night? It's unhelpful. You won't get invited to the next one. Right, so there's a really interesting piece around sleep depth. On this chart, you'll just see sleep stages. The logic is, and it's sound, 7 to 9 hours. You're a bit of a physiological phenomenon if you can get away. Lower than that, UK average would have seen was 6.2 hours, which means a majority of people are less than, well, equal number of people are less than 6.2. So sleep deprivation, particularly in the CEO culture, became a badge of honor. What's interesting about sleep is depth is king. In your sleep depth, you regulate your immune system. I didn't hear that message when COVID struck. We knew early on, vitamin D correlated with mortality. It wasn't stay home and take vitamin D. We knew obesity correlated directly with mortality from COVID. You're more likely to die with every incremental step in BMI. Stay home, wait for the vaccine. We know sleep and gut are the biggest modulators of our immune system. Nothing about fiber, nothing about sleep. Yep. And if there's ever a once-in-a-generation chance to move lifestyle away from a fluffy hobby to a meaningful health intervention, then it missed. And that breaks my heart. Deep sleep is regulation of immunity, regulation of memory. It's a rock star, but it happens in the early part of the night. If you don't get it then, you don't get it later. Right? So anything that compromises your ability to transition into sleep will be problematic. Here again, we see the curse of the modern age in the fact that most people can fall asleep because they're exhausted, but they don't go into sleep cycles because they haven't enabled the biological processes that allow it. Has anyone here had a child or got a new puppy? Not recently, but at any point. Do you sleep better or worse with those two things in the house? A little bit worse. And one of the interesting things about that, a bit like who's got an early flight, set their alarm, wakes up 5 minutes before it. Yeah, principally. Why do you not sleep well with a baby, with a dog, with an alarm? Because you won't let yourself go to deep sleep because you're waiting for something to happen. I can't go into deep sleep if I believe I've got to keep one eye on the world. One eye for a baby crying. I don't listen with my eyes. One ear for a baby crying. One ear for my alarm going off. One ear for a puppy that's puked up for the 17th time. So if I don't enable a process that says there's nothing for me to watch and listen and wait for, I cannot enable deep sleep and will see adequate or inadequate physiological recovery. If I combine thinking about something that might happen with blue light, which has now been proven to suppress melatonin, the absolutely essential hormone your body makes, again, in the early hours of sleep, then we've got a real double whammy. Blue light before I go to bed, thinking about problems. If I add in then the world's greatest miscommunication, alcohol, I've got the perfect holy trinity. Alcohol helps you fall asleep, and some of you will find that out tonight, no doubt, and I think that's fantastic. It doesn't help you fall asleep, it helps you pass out. It's a sedative. When I used to run health assessments, people came in and they're like, oh, check my liver function, or doctor, check my liver function, because I want to see if I drink too much. Great, your liver's okay, there's no signs of damage. My weight, yeah, I know there's 7 calories per gram of alcohol. Is it a problem with my weight? No, your BMI's great, body composition's good, great. But you don't sleep at all. No. If I go through a day with heightened sympathetic nervous activity, then on a very simple basis, my respiratory pattern will be different. I'll breathe more upper respiratory, less diaphragmatically. That will create and exhibit more muscle tension. Alcohol's a muscle relaxant. It's not a sleep aid. And in that moment of muscle relaxation, I get the sort of, But what I do is I kill my ability to go into a deep sleep cycle. So it helps me fall asleep, but it kills my ability to restitute during sleep. And it's the biggest sleep aid sold globally. It's insane. And again, people using alcohol when they're tired to compensate for the caffeine they ingested earlier in the day, it's a wild old spectrum. We'll talk about that in a second. So if I am in a world that's forcing me to be, again, interested in it, under the influence of light, under the influence of alcohol, heaven forbid I had some caffeine with a half-life of 8 hours any point after lunchtime, why do I expect to sleep well? People come in and they're like, I've got a sleep disorder. But I was watching a horror film on Netflix last night with 2 glasses of wine, had a triple espresso at 4 o'clock, and I just watched 24 Hour News, and there's a bomb going off in Uganda, apparently. So, not the bomb bit, but, right? 24 Hour News, caffeine, blue light, alcohol, 60% of people got a problem, right? Everyone's like, who's a sleep expert? Well, sleep experts are respiratory experts. They're looking for breathing disorders. Don't go to a sleep expert if you're living on caffeine, alcohol, blue light, and 24 Hour News. When I first started measuring stress, and here's an interesting part about the graph, I thought people were super stressed. I was working with CEOs, executives. They're super stressed because they're super busy. They're not super stressed. They're physiologically under-recovered. And it's exactly the same outcome measurement. If you're too sympathetic, it's the same as being too little parasympathetic. Your blood pressure's higher, heart rate's higher, digestive secretions are impaired. We don't have a stress problem. We have a physiological relaxation problem. So when I look for generating client results, my single purpose is how do I create more parasympathetic tone, and what energy does that produce to solve the problem the person brought to me in the first place? And what we love is when people attribute behaviors to weakness, right? If I give you 15 coffees now, let's do less, let's do 6, 3 glasses of wine, and I tell you something really terrible just before you go to sleep, and you wake up tomorrow, will you be in a good mood or a bad mood? Let me play my wife in this scenario. She'll be in a bad mood. She'll be more likely to want a croissant than an omelette. It's interesting, because she didn't restore enough energy, so she'll crave energy. She'll be drawn to carbohydrate. And we know with low glucose, again, impaired tolerance during sleep, people are going to be more likely to choose, again, a high energy density food. With that, again, I'm facing a pattern we call dysglycemia. I'll be more likely to, again, use caffeine. I'll be more likely with that caffeinated system to need alcohol to down-regulate it. And when someone says, I'm addicted to carbs, I'm addicted to coffee, I'm addicted to alcohol, they might well be in a pattern of dependency upon those. And I have to break that cycle somewhere. So I have to choose the weakest link and try and extract it in there. But what's interesting about this, none of this feels like a clinical psychologist's job to me. This feels pretty simple stuff. And the idea that it's not taking place in every gym in the country, I find also interesting. Maybe it is. And I think one of the fears about stress is, who's the expert? We've got experts on mindset like Glenda, and again, that course is just perfect in terms of how do we build resilience. That's a critical piece. But for me, there's 3 stages in managing stress, okay? So if there's an individual who is dysfunctional from stress, and I could use that as simply as they don't have enough energy, their fatigue ability is high, their overtraining propensity is high, etc., then do I try and change the world? In that situation where the lady's husband was so stressed, do I have him knocked off? Hitman. Life event. For something to become dysfunctional, in the first instance, it has to exist, a volume of pressures, which is too great. So I could go and say, let's get rid of the pressures. Your job's the pressure, quit your job. Your spouse is the pressure, quit your spouse. Your commute's the pressure, quit the commute. And you'll find life coaches who do that. They go, what are all the things in your life? How many of them add value? How many don't? Clear it out. That's fine. Biggest area of intervention is, as Glenda says earlier, the only stresses you make are the ones you perceive. If I'm on an aeroplane and I believe that plane is going to crash, my physiology will be very different to the person next to me who believes that plane is going to land in Tenerife for a lovely 2-week holiday. We're both sat on a plane. There's a great argument around, is anxiety a hyperfixation with the future, a catastrophized future? Is depression an excessive rumination on the past? Is happiness being in the present? There's an argument for that, and that's the whole philosophy behind mindfulness, that I'm not predicting catastrophes, I'm not ruminating on past disasters. If I'm in the now, that's valuable, and I can do mindfulness with gardening, chewing, eating, breathing. But from a mindset point of view, the more stresses I see, the more stresses I create. And there'll be people who help with that. Cognitive behavioral therapists would help with that. Lots of psychological professionals. Glenda's mindset course would reduce the number of stresses you see by changing the way you see the world. I'm interested in physiological intervention because there's a layer beyond that that's not that complicated. Where I go, right, I've still created, by there being something and me seeing something, a problem in my physiology. So what would that look like if I down-regulated my sympathetic nervous system through breath? So we can do something as simple. Let's put our feet on the floor. Let's do a physiological sigh, known since the 1930s to down-regulate sympathetic drive, instantly create more parasympathetic. If you're up for it, put your feet on the floor. We'll do a quick breath. So we're going to do, again, I'll do one first. I'm going to breathe in through my nose. Then I'm going to do another inhalation, and then out through my mouth. If we do 2 to 3 of those, let's do it together. In on 3. Take a normal breath in between. In we go. You immediately start to engage parasympathetic tone. You watch someone who's stress breathing, it's up here, they're getting ready for danger. You watch a baby breathing, it's diaphragmatic and belly. Reason for that, the vagus nerve, which we hear a lot about, interfaces with your diaphragm. I can take a stressful situation, make it less stressful through breath work instantly. So who's teaching that? At the end of your PT sessions in the company I work in, we do breath work to down-regulate sympathetic drive, enhance recovery. It's just logical. Meditation, it's not philosophical, it's not Eastern, it's not spiritual, it's not chakra-driven, it's not meridians. It's an ability, it can be, on top of those things, an incredible way of down-regulating your nervous system. Play, humor, creativity, cold water therapy. Look at things that have trended in the last few years and then ask yourself whether they would create more parasympathetic tone. And they do. None of these things are single-point effectiveness. You can't base your life on, I'm going to have a horrible life and then jump in a cold water tub every morning. But if you do cold water immersion therapy, you will have a less likelihood of falling ill from stress. I remember years ago when someone was scared of public speaking and they were offered a beta blocker. It's a good example. Beta blocker medication just blocks the adrenaline landing on your heart. So it didn't change the fact they had to public speak. It didn't change the fact they were shit scared of what people thought of them. It just stopped their body reacting to that thought. And in that moment, they can public speak. If we remove the physiology of stress, we change the way we look at the world. I cannot feel stressed if I'm physiologically relaxed. That's a really important phrase. I cannot feel stressed. So why don't we, instead of trying to change the world and change mindset, change the way we feel to change the way we think, rather than change the way we think to change the way we feel. Because one's really difficult and one is an absolute doddle. All of those things would change my likelihood of spending more time in parasympathetic tone, more physiological recovery, measurable or not measurable, and all of those things could be prescribed, recommended, coached in a gym environment, deliberately, not ad hoc, not poorly. And if we don't do that, we're going to wake up to the fact that someone else is going to gobble up the opportunity of well-being. Fitness isn't well-being, by a long, long way. Can't control one domain of lifestyle and say you've got it cracked. If you add nutrition in, certainly to a degree. But if you're just moving people, nourishing people, and they're being beasted to the point of falling over, etc., they're struggling. Am I okay on time, Rob? 5, fantastic. I put this up here because, again, 51% of long-term absenteeism from work is stress-orientated. There's no stress professional. None. So I go into organizations, I talk about stress, and I prescribe movement. I send them to gyms because it's the biggest single way of increasing parasympathetic tone. I mentioned that breath work and meditation move the dial on heart rate variability and autonomic nervous system. The only other bigger thing is taking someone from inactive to active. Activity changes everything. It's why when you get fitter, you have a lower resting heart rate. You're not getting a huge heart in 6 weeks' time. That means your resting heart rate's gone from 72 to 66. You've got more parasympathetic tone, resting heart rate, visible. And if you're not on board with this, don't worry, the products have got this covered. Aura have got this covered. Aura do heart rate variability, sleep coaching, direct to consumer, no interest in fitness. Whoop do the same. Muse do electroencephalography guided biofeedback meditation. You've got Whoop, again, direct to consumer. These products are dealing with coaching people on stress, recovery, and sleep through no professional outlet whatsoever because they don't think there's a trusted partner for them. Fitness is going to miss out on well-being because it's not a practitioner unless it recognizes. Now, not everyone wants to be well-being. Some people want to be fitness. Some people want to be performance. But if you want to be well-being and there's people in your gyms wearing these devices and you can't communicate with them, to them, leverage them, that's a really interesting challenge. Mental health first aiders, mental health apps exploded. If you go to an organization, their budget has been consumed with mental health provision. Again, the rise in anxiety and mental health, why is that occurring? And again, there's many, many potential reasons. But I love one of the main diagnostic criteria of depression. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. The single most cited reason for being given an antidepressant. I've got 7 minutes to solve your depression. I do not want a suicide on my watch. You'll go on an SSRI antidepressant. I can't solve the fact you haven't slept well for 3 months, you get no physiological recovery, you've got none of these things in your life. Now, I'm not saying the absence of these behaviors is a cause of depression, but I'm categorically saying the presence of these behaviors will diminish the incidence and effect of depression on populations. So mental health is not separate from physical health, and you cannot have good cognitive clarity with low physiological energy. It doesn't work. And when you have a chronic fatigue syndrome, you're sent to a psychologist because they think you can think your way out of it. It's a really complicated disease. I put this up here because the experts are already out there. If you've got frequent digestive upsets, there's a Rene for you. If you've got frequent tiredness, there's caffeine for you. If you've got unrefreshing sleep, there's alcohol or Xanax for you. If you've got stubborn weight, heightened stress, low libido, I can put a product in every one of those places, compensating for a symptom of dysfunctional physiology that comes from a root cause born out of inadequate lifestyle. So that marketplace, 4.2 trillion well-being globally, has got very little fitness input. And again, we're seeing some services and we're seeing some products, but you exist in a well-being product marketplace because there are no services. What's a well-being service? If you did an audit on movement quality, nutrition quality, sleep quality, management of caffeine and alcohol, you're immediately a well-being product, or you've got a well-being service. Within that, again, where would I summarize? Recovery is not about reducing DOMs from a brutal leg session. Recovery is the critical mass of biological systems that restore energy, and it's as integral to human health and physiology as movement and nutrition, arguably more so. If you want to become a lifestyle expert, you need to build competency across the domains, not become a subspecialist in a subspecialist. If you don't want to be a lifestyle expert, that also is a fantastic career. This is about the opportunity of well-being. Stress and recovery can be quantified. Products exist. They just haven't involved you in that process. Again, if you're interested in that further, again, my tool of choice is First Beat. I do use a variety of other markers to look at that. But for me, that gives me quantitative data on something people have always assumed was completely subjective. If you add recovery in, it will open up corporate well-being. No corporate's going to buy a movement talk. No corporate's going to buy a nutrition talk. They might have done in COVID, not anymore. They'll buy a performance talk. They'll buy a stress talk. They'll buy a sleep talk. All roads lead to more activity, but you have to find a different way to build that narrative. You can find out more. I do have, again, a technical training course. I'm not selling it today. That teaches practical stress resilience coaching in the area of physiology. And you can follow me on Instagram, where I'm relatively active and building a loyal but small following. I'm run over, so apologies. I'm very happy to take questions, but thanks for your attention at the end of a long day, I'm sure. Lovely to see you all.